about Donna this week in all my classes and with all my students that it's a thrill. I sort of hardly believe she's really here to give this very prestigious Allison and John Davis lecture. I've been telling my students how proud I am of Donna, who graduated in 1991. And yes, she was a student of mine, but also other people in the audience. And I keep on telling them she's exactly the kind of student I want them to be. I tell them because I want them to use all the expensive education that they have received to do just what she is doing. Speaking truth to power. Confronting the horrors of contemporary American racial capitalism, and combining deep thought, extensive research, and hard intellectual work with real social activism and movement. From the days of Rayford Logan, Sterling Brown, Allison, and John Davis, to the more recent years when Donna was here, Williams has had a habit of turning out stellar Black activist intellectuals. I can't quite figure out why, but it is happening. While here, they struggled to change Williams, and of course, once they went out into the wider world, they changed it too. They did so by thinking, writing, and doing. Which brings me to Donna's work and her topic, Transcending Punishment, tonight. Donna is already a prolific, highly respected historian with 2 books under her belt, another soon to come out, and many articles in important journals like the Black Scholar and the Journal of American History. Donna went to graduate school at Berkeley and, not surprisingly, ended up doing her research on the strong links between the early Black Panther Party and Berkeley and Merritt colleges in the 1960s. At Berkeley, Donna combined traditional historical sources with her very important, extensive, innovative oral interviews of former Black Panthers to produce a beautifully written, cool, important, and award-winning book that's on sale outside on the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. It's called Living for the City: Migration, Education, and the Rise of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. And it's an important book for several reasons. Besides recovering history that would otherwise be lost, as so much of Black and revolutionary history is, Donna's book is intent on teaching us lessons. Lessons about the failures and the successes of the Black Panthers. And I prefer, of course, to stress the successes. And so they are, as she talks about them, the Panthers' innovative, creative, grassroots organizations and community programs, their strong emphasis on education, in study groups, via the newspaper, in the breakfast programs, their strong organizing base in college student organizations at Berkeley and Merritt colleges. Yes, Black student unions and diverse Williams groups can change the world. And their early, thoughtful, and sustained anti-imperialist internationalism. Donna's early work on the Panthers inevitably entailed studying the war of the U.S. government against the Panthers and against Black people in general. The effect that the tortures of solitary confinement had on folks like Huey Newton and countless others. The everyday brutalities of police arrest and incarceration that have shaped Black lives ever since the end of slavery. From her work on the Panthers, it was a natural short hop, skip, and jump to her current topic of research, the nature of which I still call the prison-industrial complex, but which younger intellectuals like Donna they're now calling the carceral state. They're not saying it properly. Particularly in the mega-prison state of California, and its relationship to Black lives and Black resistance. She has 2 books coming out on this crucial area of research, an edited volume on Challenging Punishment, Race and the War on Drugs, which I believe is finished pretty much, because it's an edited collection. It's very close. And her own detailed work on the Reagan era called Crack in Los Angeles, Policing the Crisis and the War on Drugs. These books promise, like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, to change our conversation on imprisonment, to uncover the myriad ways in which the prison complex is tied to millions and millions of dollars of sordid profits. Just as the police violence in Ferguson is tied to a system of local policing for profit, showing, as Donna says, that literally racism pays. And I'm sure that her work will also show how prisoners and communities resist America's carceral state through prison strikes, riots, demonstrations, movements for transformative justice, and more. Lest you think that Donna has just been sitting in a library writing books, she has not. Donna's life and work thrives on the interaction between theory and practice. Donna has been active in the movements she writes about. She is a member participant of the struggles today against our unfinished business from Reconstruction. She has brought Ferguson activist youth to the National Conference of the Organization of American Historians. She has spoken at rallies and demonstrations organized not by academics but by activists. She has appeared in movies and a recent courageous YouTube video. And she writes not just for academic journals, but for important organs of youth resistance today, like Jacobin. From Oakland to Ferguson, from Ferguson to Palestine, from the Black Panther Party to Black Lives Matter, from the incarceration of black youth to the growing prison abolition movement, Donna's work on all these issues is following the paths of the resistance of yesterday to the rebellion currently underway in small towns and big cities, in the South and in the North, in prisons, on college campuses, and yes, even at Williams College. And that is the thought I want to leave you with. I've been at Williams almost 30 years. Never before have I seen such sustained student activism over so many different but interrelated issues. Donna, you would be proud of your current alumni. They are striking out in new directions. They're challenging the college to divest from fossil fuels. They are taking students to demonstrations, linking a million hoodies with the fossil fuel divestment movement. They are thinking about ways to follow Columbia University's path-breaking footsteps and get the college to divest from prison investments. They are having teach-ins and workshops linking the Palestinian movement to the cause of arrested migrants in Arizona and Texas. They are protesting for the rights of the undocumented. They are challenging us all to change our gendered vocabulary and our institutional procedures to seek justice for transgender and queer students. Oh, and I am supposed to say, if you're interested, use the hashtag PrisonNation on Twitter to follow along tonight. That's from them to you, and I don't know how to do it. Like you, and like the Panthers in Oakland in 1964, these young people are on the cutting edge of a new internationalism. You are at the right place at the right time, a perfect role model for this newly energized generation of young resistors. We welcome you back, we salute your work, and we look forward to an invigorating talk that will help us think and organize in radically new ways to get, I have to do this, Donna, to get what the Panthers wanted, but we still have not gotten. Power to the people.
Tonight's talk, I prepared actually a kind of formal address because it's an honor to be here, and it's in a way, even though it's a formal address, it's a deeply autobiographical talk. in which I'm going to talk some about my own intellectual formation and the central role that Williams played in it, and many of my teachers are in the audience. I would especially like to thank Shanti and Televadrosis and Charles Dew, who were so generous to me when I was here. And really, you know, there's something about people being generous to you when you're very young, when you're still in that process of formation, and really are trying to figure out who you are and who you want to be. And, you know, there were a number of people at Williams, some of whom I'll be talking about tonight, who really were central to me in my life, and you know, in the paths that I took, and gave me access to things that I had never had before. So bear with me, I'm going to read a formal talk, and then I look forward to us being able to actually have an exchange. So thank you everyone for coming. It's truly amazing to be back here in Brooks Rogers Hall. The last time I was here, that I remember being here, I had, along with some other students, invited Donna Ward. And for me, that was just, it was a life-changing experience to see her. I read her work and discovered it through a peer at Williams. And to actually see the woman who wrote Sister Outsider to me was absolutely incredible. So I feel really honored to be standing on the stage that she was standing on nearly 30 years ago. As I've been walking around campus, I've been overcome with a flood of memories of my time here at Williams, which was truly a formative period in my life. It wasn't always an easy time, but it was absolutely a formative time. Looking back, I can see the threads of what my life would later become. But at the most, it was just a glimmer, an intuition, a sense of anxiety around the things I cared most about, but ultimately would help inform my life choices. It has been 24 years since I've returned to this campus, 2 more years in my age upon graduating. So I'm having a middle-aged moment. It's disorienting indeed. When I was an undergraduate, Williams and the world beyond it was quite different from today. When I came in 1987, Ronald Reagan was president, and when I graduated, George Bush Sr. was ending his single term. The governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton, was less than a distant possibility for the presidency. Although this era bridged the Cold War with its aftermath, it was thoroughly saturated by anti-communism, as well as an awareness and a simultaneous commitment to state socialism and the ideas of the left, which I think is very hard to imagine today. Joshua Tree had come out in the late 80s, and Bono had not yet been tainted by his association with neoliberal humanitarianism, or Samantha Powers. So it was quite different. Williams College and even Williamstown reflected this historical moment profoundly in ways I could never have fully imagined in the little Rust Belt city where I grew up in western Pennsylvania. I came to Williams in the fall of 1987 after applying early decision. What drew me was the promise of a really good liberal arts education and the physical beauty of the Purple Mountains. What I found was something very different from what I expected or could have known. It was a campus filled with students from the magnet schools of New York City, from the exclusive private academies at Choate, Andover, Exeter, Trinity, and Deerfield. It was, in essence, a class of people that I didn't even know existed growing up in Erie, Pennsylvania. And despite the campus's geographic remoteness, there were personal and intimate connections between Williams and global political economy and foreign policy of the 1980s. In a class on American popular culture, for example, I had a discussion section with a fair-haired, freckled young woman who shared the last name of an authoritarian ruler who was ousted by the Sandinistas. And she was not alone. In my cohort, and the ones before me, every class had a not insignificant number of last names seen in newspaper headlines, especially those from conservative, anti-populist tendencies. It was rumored that the Shah of Iran had bought his son a house in Williamstown. And of course, there was the arch-conservative William Bennett, a leading cultural warrior and Williams alum. An underclassman from San Diego was often playing hacky sack in the freshman quad, kept mentioning Uncle Barry. Uncle Barry turned out to be Barry Goldwater. I was confused. It was a very conservative campus, so much so that we had to go to Dartmouth to have fun. I'm concerned this may still be the case. Williams in the 1980s was a place where you felt surprisingly close to the centers of Cold War political and economic power. Yet precisely because of this, proximity, there was also a deep sense of how my own difference began to emerge. Being here, living in the Berkshire Quad, at that time known as the Odd Quad, sharpened my ideas about class and privilege, because as Karl Marx knew, class is relational. It merges and defines itself against another social force. And of course, the same thing is true for race. And of course, there were the contradictions of a Cold War campus like Williams. While the school was a historic center for networks of arbitrage, it was also a place that provided the tools to critique and even oppose its underpinnings. I'd never heard that word before coming to Williams, but forever after it rolled off my tongue, arbitrage. This was not a word I learned in the classroom. It was a word I heard from students, from parents-teacher weekend, at the snack bar, at keg parties, or in conversations from senior political economy majors who were looking for jobs. Arbitrage was everywhere in the 1980s. I wonder, is it still? But there was also the sense of point and counterpoint which I had described. In the political science department, Kurt Tauber taught a class on Marxism regularly. He was close friends with Professor Carlos Egan, who died in a plane crash in Honduras after returning from Nicaragua, where he'd been engaged with solidarity efforts with the Sandinistas. A few years before, he actually brought the Nicaraguan national basketball team to Williams under the Sandinistas. The 1980s was a complicated time at Williams. So for me, at a personal level, Williams really was a time of learning about new things and feeling a proximity, not just intellectually, but even through personal and intimate networks to global forces, which in many ways I did not have access to growing up in the Rust Belt. One of the most formative experiences I had was actually taking a class with Professor Singham, who taught a class my sophomore year called Slavery, Colonialism, and Imperialism. It was the first time in this class that I glimpsed what it meant to be a historian, to read primary sources, and to be immersed in the meaning of the past. I think of some of my best and most vibrant memories at Williams came from studying for class, especially for Shanti's classes. This course was my entry point into a world of radical history, a retelling of the past that analyzed relations of power between what we called then the First and the Third World. Today we would talk about this in terms of the global North and the global South. Shanti had us read great works of Caribbean history, the great Caribbean radicals, Eric Williams, Capital and Slavery, Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins. These works taught me the importance of history and political economy to understand the relations of power in the present. And it is in that spirit that I open my talk today, Transcending Punishment, Black Liberation, Resistance, and the Criminalization of America's Most Vulnerable. As I look back on the 1980s, from the distance of nearly 30 years, what strikes me most is not the things that were visible, but the things that were invisible. At the time, I was hyper-aware of the United States' new and reinvigorated anti-communist foreign policy under Reagan. Indeed, another one of my teachers, who I've not yet mentioned, was Professor Decima Williams, the former ambassador to the United Nations under Maurice Bishop. After a CIA-sponsored coup, Bishop was killed, and many members of his government were forced into exile inside the United States, and Decima joined this group of political refugees. Her passport had been seized, her files, her books, and many of her personal belongings. But she found a safe harbor at Williams, where she was teaching Caribbean politics in the late 80s and early 90s. It was Professor Williams who gave me my first copy of Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, who first told me about Franz Fanon, and I still have that copy. It would literally take me years to fully understand what it meant. So because of Decima and the other faculty on the campus where I stand now, I was hyper-aware of the Reagan administration's wars of covert action in Latin America and the Caribbean. Looking back, I was very conscious of war abroad, but not of war at home, and what the connections between the two might be. Foremost among these was the war on drugs and other punishment campaigns inside the U.S. that accompanied it. The war on drugs, the war on gangs, and the war on the poor. Domestic war on America's most vulnerable populations. It was a war that was probably invisible if you lived in the suburbs, in a working-class white neighborhood like the one I grew up in, or in a citadel of privilege. but it was happening nonetheless. The signs were there in news and popular culture, alarmist stories about the crack epidemic, gun violence in the inner city. The release of the films Mo Better Blues, Clockers, and the whole genre of so-called ghetto-exploitation films, including Straight Outta Brooklyn, Juice, and New Jack City. NWA's breakout hit, FTP, that's now become an anthem in Ferguson protests. The signs were definitely there. But at a more personal level, I had had my own experiences with the war on drugs, but didn't even understand what I was looking at. And I just wanted to share a quick anecdote about this. Because I'm writing a book on it, and writing a book on a period that I myself lived through and remember, it's that reckoning with history and memory. And my own most profound memory of the war on drugs and the crack epidemic was something very ordinary, which is that in Erie, my mother and I used to go to a donut shop that was on the east side of the city, and it was actually about, I would call it the poorest part of the city. Erie is a Rust Belt city, in many ways an abandoned city. And I remember we would go at night to get donuts when they were fresh out of the oven. We went over Christmas break, and it's very, very cold. This is, I don't want to say pre-global warming, but much colder than it is. Winters are much colder then than they are now. And I remember going late at night and seeing a group of little boys standing outside, aged 10 or 11, in an area that was completely abandoned. And I didn't know what to make of it. And looking back on it, I know what that meant. That was speaking to the economic collapse in Erie and to how much of the drug economy itself is an economy of child labor. And it is this group of people, marginalized and most vulnerable, criminalized by the state, but shut out economically, that are the true objects of the war on drugs. And so I remember there are certain moments in your life where it's not a sensational story, it was something I witnessed, and I was trying to figure out what it meant. And now, in writing my book on crack and the war on drugs, I go back to that memory to try to explain how we got there. This is a story that cannot be understood without considering the history of U.S. wars in Central America, as well as the domestic and overlapping punishment campaigns in the U.S. against our most vulnerable populations, young, black, and brown, and low income. In the 1980s, however, mass incarceration and mass criminalization at these most vulnerable populations was not fully visible. Instead, the focus was on the people themselves, people who were the ultimate targets of mass incarceration, not the politics that created it. The 1980s was such a period of flux and change that what was emerging was not yet visible. One of the most interesting dimensions of historical processes is that they are afoot long before they can be discerned, felt, and analyzed. There is change before change is visible. It was not until I began studying the history of the Black Power movement in graduate school that I came to fully understand that organized punishment campaigns directed largely against black and brown populations that followed in the wake of widespread mobilization of communities of color. In the past year, there's been much discussion of the militarization of policing, but it is rarely put in its historical context. At the very earliest, journalists have gestured towards the change wrought in the aftermath of 9/11, the 1033 Act, and its importance for the transfer of military-grade hardware to local police departments. But if you really want to understand the kind of militarization and punishment campaigns that we see from the 1970s forward, you have to go back to the history of mass mobilization, the Black Power movement, and the other movements of youth in the 1960s and 1970s. The seismic shift towards mass incarceration and militarization of policing in the U.S. started not in the 1980s, but nearly a decade and a half before Ronald Reagan's election as president. Indeed, the unlocked weapons against crime, drugs, and gangs can be traced back to the state's response to the massive upheaval of youth movements in the 60s and 70s. So I'm going to take us back to a seminal moment in U.S. history, which is the Watts Rebellion, which follows in the immediate aftermath of the victories of the Civil Rights Movement. In 1965, just 5 days after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the culmination of decades of struggle to dismantle the brutal system of Jim Crow segregation in the South, the largest civil disturbance in U.S. history up until that point broke out in L.A. Its epicenter was Watts. The city's poorest district was composed overwhelmingly of recent African-American migrants from the South. Like many of the urban rebellions in the 1960s, it was triggered by an instance of police brutality. On August 11, 1965, 5 days after the signing of the Voting Rights Act, the community of Watts erupted in violent protest after the police beat and jailed a 21-year-old African-American youth and abused his mother. Watts surprised the rest of the country because it broke out in a moment of victory, the culmination of the Southern Civil Rights Movement push for civil and electoral inclusion. Its very name became symbolic of Black militancy that looked to armed self-defense, direct confrontation with the state, and economic redistribution as political imperatives. From hindsight, many view Watts as initiating the new era of Black power politics. Black power's threads are many and extend far back into the densely woven fabric of African American resistance in the New World. Indeed, it draws upon long-standing traditions of independent self-definition, Black nationalism, and self-determination. But its invocation as a popular slogan and a form of self-assertion was new. In Stokely Carmichael's words, quote, the only way we're going to stop white men from whooping us is to take over. We've been saying freedom for 6 years, and we don't have anything. What we're going to start saying now is Black power. Black power drew on the many domestic victories of both the Southern Civil Rights Movement and the global push for decolonization. The independence of 30 African states in 1960, the anti-colonial and state socialist struggles in Cuba, Vietnam, and Congo had profound impact on the emergence of the domestically rooted but internationally focused and inspired Black youth activism in the U.S. During one of the peaks of Cold War violence, not only East versus West, but perhaps most importantly, North versus South, Black power married the anger of poor and working class Black populations in American cities with a global and international struggle over decolonization and against occupation. This was no more evident than in the agitation propaganda of the Black Panther Party for self-defense. Particularly for economically marginal youth, many of whom were recent migrants for the South, Watts and the other long hot summers that followed were deeply meaningful rebellions that called attention to the everyday effects of state violence, structural exclusion, and white supremacy. Bayard Rustin observed that Black power organizing addressed the brass tacks material questions of housing, education, and jobs. So for the first kind of wave of Black freedom struggle, we had a struggle over legal equality. But what we see after 1965 is largely a struggle over social rights, over economic access. Black power and the urban rebellions made visible the problems of the urban North and its forgotten populations that had been largely untouched by the victories of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. On October 15, 1966, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale founded the Black Panther Party for self-defense. So they speak directly to and express the kind of anger, disorientation, disillusionment of the Watts Rebellion and channel that energy into an organized political action. Although cultural nationalist expressions like those of the US organization, who founded Kwanzaa, although they have become the mainstream face of Black power today, it was anti-capitalist organizations like the Revolutionary Action Movement, RAM, and especially the Black Panther Party that captured the imagination of large numbers of Black youth, again in ways that were hard to imagine up until the protests we've seen in the last 14 months. I stress this last point because too often this history has been lost or forgotten. This earlier history of Black radicalism that married the traditions of Black consciousness with struggles over economic self-determination. Too often people invoke the Panthers as if they were old school cultural nationalists, and they defined them as a Black revitalization movement. But actually, they were an interesting fusion between revolutionary Black nationalism, later internationalism, Marxist thought, and Maoism. They even read early writings by Manuel Wallerstein, and I've actually looked at them in the Panther archives. So they were reading about modern world systems theory and trying to figure out how local struggles inside the United States fit within these larger movements of capital. So they brought together these traditions of Black self-determination and Marxism. They also believed in strong alliances with groups they called mother country radicals, like the White Appalachian Patriot Party, the radical wing of the anti-war movement. So they aligned themselves with the Peace and Freedom Party, which was an electoral peace close allies included the Asian American or Red Guard Party, and the Brown Berets. And they looked for alliances based on anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, and sustained opposition to the Vietnam War. They earned the ire of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, who called them the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States in 1968. This is so important because I think precisely what made the Panthers so dangerous was this bringing together of local with international politics. This linking of struggles, and you can see it, and Emory Douglas expresses it better than I ever could. This linking of police violence at home to military violence abroad, and then seeking a coalition across different groups to fight this politics both at home and abroad. One of the most striking things about what Hoover says about the Panthers is that he says it precisely in the moment in '68 when the Panthers are turning away from police patrols and armed self-defense. So the legal basis for them is overturned in May '67. And it's in this moment when they found freedom schools and they start turning towards long-term sustained organizations. So free breakfast programs, the freedom schools, and ultimately they found the longest running institution, the Black Panther Party, which is a Huey P. Newton Intercommunal Institute. So the idea of a self-sustaining institution of a school, of a sustained form of political education, was most threatening of all to J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. And I'd like to start my discussion about the backlash against Black mobilization by thinking about that, the FBI's response to the Black Panther Party, and more broadly, not only the Panthers, but the draconian response to Watts, the other urban rebellions that initiated a new era in American policing, law enforcement, and incarceration. It's very striking that after the Watts Rebellion, the police arrest 4,000 people, and they conduct large-scale house-to-house searches. In addition, law enforcement begins at this moment to work to acquire military-grade hardware and elite tactical units that self-consciously talked about counterinsurgency campaigns against urban protests and Black and brown power organizations. In 1968, the LAPD found SWAT, and the first time it's used is against the Southern California Black Panther Party. Significantly, every single member of SWAT was an ex-veteran, either from Korea or Vietnam. So that's what we see again in state response, the connections between war abroad and war at home. The commanding force used a tank on loan from the National Guard and won Department of Justice authorization for a grenade launcher against the Southern California Black Panther Party for 41st and Central. SWAT is very important because it marked a new era in law enforcement, not only for the city of Los Angeles, but for the rest of the country. It established a template for militarized policing across the country that laterally expanded in the overlapping domestic wars against drugs, gangs, and crime in subsequent years. So SWAT becomes best known during the war on drugs. Today we have Dallas SWAT, we have reality shows based on SWAT, but it's actually developed really as a self-conscious counterinsurgency tool against urban protest and Black radical organization. In a move that influenced other police departments, the LAPD used federal monies from the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, the LEAA, to develop additional militarized units. So SWAT is really the first of a whole series of units. You have the hardcore drug unit, the OSS, and you have most notorious like TRASH, which is later named CRASH, which some of you may know about from the Rampart scandal. So you have the Declaration of War on Drugs by Richard Nixon in 1971. You have the passage of the Rockefeller drug laws. And what goes along with this is a transformation of policing where increasingly resources are targeted towards elite commando units that are focused on policing drugs and gangs. So I think it's important to go back to this history in the 1960s and 1970s. When we saw those images from Ferguson of tanks, assault rifles, and Kevlar being used against citizens, maybe the discussion went back to talking about post 9/11 or the 1033 Act. But the original 1033 Act was initiated in 1991 and was a part of the war on drugs. So looking at this deeper history helps us explain why the protests in Baltimore, Ferguson, New York, and other cities across the country have had such a deep resonance for so many groups of people. Each generation has a moment when its members share an instance of collective experience that is forever etched into their memory. For the civil rights and Black Power generation, it is unquestionably the open casket funeral of Emmett Till. The disfigured remains of this 14-year-old boy became a mirror in which Black youth witnessed their most vulnerable selves. The sight was so excruciating that it helped catalyze direct action protests from rural Alabama to the streets of Oakland for nearly a decade and a half. Today, for a broad swath of people, ranging in age from those born in the waning years of the Black Power movement through the interstice between the 20th and 21st centuries, this moment was embodied in Ferguson. The precise calculation of generation is elusive. As Jeff Chang has argued, generations are fictions. And yet we all have a personal and a public sense of time that places us within a cohort of history. Whether we use the branding terms, the hip-hop generation, or Generation X, or the not-for-profit brand of millennial youth, particularly for those who came of age under Presidents Ronald Reagan through Barack Obama, the events in the small municipality outside northern St. Louis were profoundly meaningful. It might even be said that the events of the past year have helped distinguish the post-civil rights generation from iconic baby boomers, because the months of mass protest announced what many of us feel is the most pressing domestic political crisis of our time: this emergence of a massive edifice of policing, surveillance, prisons, and punishment that is unprecedented both in U.S. and in global history. Word and image of Michael Brown's killing first spread to the residents of Canfield Green, where he lay, and then through the digital magic of cyber networks to the rest of the St. Louis metro area, the nation, and the world. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and Vine carried the story beyond the city's periphery, ultimately forcing mainstream media to reckon with its gravity. So this relationship between in-person protest and social media is key to the dynamics of Ferguson, and also a number of precedents for it, both the protests over Trayvon Martin, Troy Davis, and I would also link it to the similar dynamics in the Occupy movement and the Arab uprisings. Equally important, the impact and longevity of Ferguson as a site of protest and mobilization was the ingenuity and commitment of protesters who refused to leave, even when confronted with tanks, military hardware, and clouds of tear gas. Instead of giving in, they started publicly counting the days of sustained resistance, and in so doing, announced to St. Louis County and the rest of the world that they would not stop until they attained justice for Mike Brown and the many other men, women, and children shot down by the police. The protest has been going on for over 400 days and still continues. So the central point here is it's not simply the violence we saw in Ferguson that's made it such an iconic moment. It was the sustained resistance. So literally start counting days of resistance. And it showed that young people with relatively few resources in a very deindustrialized and quite impoverished part of the country showed how to directly confront police authorities. And I was in Ferguson in those first months, and it was incredible to see people coming from New York and Los Angeles and Chicago really coming to Ferguson to try to figure out how to do what they did. So I want us to continue to think about Ferguson. In some ways, the locus and the coverage has shifted to the larger cities that are better resourced, that have established organizations, established not-for-profits, and established funding networks. But I want to remember this moment where you had a geographical fight that was deeply socially based through a broad spectrum of the population as being a really foundational moment that influenced what would happen in other cities. What made Ferguson into such a watershed moment was not simply the terror-inspiring image of police impunity, but that a large cohort of African-American youth decided to fight back and confront state authorities. Along the way, they developed allies and co-conspirators, in the words of Black Lives Matter founder Alicia Garza, from different ethnic and racial communities, more affluent cities across the country, and international solidarity groups. This was nowhere more evident than with Palestinians, who tweeted from the West Bank in early August with instructions about how to mitigate the effects of tear gas. International exchange continued and deepened in the months that followed. Protesters and ordinary people created and maintained memorials in the place where Michael Brown's body lay, set up camp in front of the Ferguson Police Headquarters on South Florissant, and marched regularly along what a local minister called Jericho Road. stretching from Canfield Drive to the edge of Delaware, a neighboring black municipality. Demonstrator staff pickets in front of the Ferguson Police Station for 21 hours a day, sharing rides and food as they crafted their own movement culture. Direct action protests like these later spread to the Shaw District in South St. Louis, following the murder of 18-year-old Conrad Myers, who was shot 6 times in the legs and once in the face after a policeman employed by a private security firm mistook Myers' sandwich for a gun. As this mosaic of struggle indicates, over the past year, Ferguson and the greater St. Louis metro area became a laboratory and a genesis point for new types of protest, new types of activism against state-sanctioned violence. It has also helped inspire a new wave of 21st century iterations of Black power, both for local youth and for those across North America. These efforts and the national and international press and social media coverage they generated marked a turning point, a before and after, in which perception changed. Solidarity protests in New York, Los Angeles, and smaller cities throughout the country immediately followed, and in the process, a national collective memory was forged. Witnessing the events, especially the past year, have been deeply and profoundly moving to me, and they point towards a future in which we dismantle the current system of mass incarceration and look to a world in which state punishment, domestic and international war, is no longer the default solution to problems of perceived crisis. In many respects, it is precisely people your age and a little older who are leading the struggle against a war without end. Central to this process is political education and the knowledge of history. And, to bring this full circle to where I started my talk, which is, it was at Williams, through studying Caribbean history, African American history, histories of anti-colonial struggles, also in Ireland and Wales, that really made it possible for me, as I moved into adulthood and into my career, to think about how to apply that knowledge to contemporary political struggles. So that connection between the historical and the present is very important. And I think that one of the challenges we face today, particularly with the cuts in higher education and the assault on humanities, is that the kinds of political education that were absolutely essential to the mobilizations of the 1960s and 1970s are less available to youth today. I teach at a public university, and we are suffering terrible cuts, increases in tuition, and education itself is becoming something that many people are shut out from. So the importance of political education, figuring out ways both to make demands on the state and higher education. I was very excited in the first Democratic debate to hear Bernie Sanders say 4 times that higher education should be free. I have never heard that said in a Democratic primary. And I think that it reflects this sense of larger crisis around higher education. I feel very privileged to have the education I did at Williams, and in many ways that I couldn't predict, it shaped my future work. And so I'd like to conclude by quoting James Baldwin, who I often turn to for the beauty and the power of his expression. In a speech at the National Press Club in 1986, during Ronald Reagan's second presidential term, on the eve of the Iran-Contra hearings, James Baldwin reflected on the importance of history and of America's discomfort in reckoning with the full burden of its meaning. Quote, "One of the things that has always afflicted American reality and American vision is an aversion to history. History is not something you read about in a book. History is not even past, it's present. Because everybody operates, whether we know it or not, out of assumptions which are produced only and only by our history." Thank you. Please share them with us.
That, right.
Did you have a question on
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk about that the image and.
First, I have to put the image
Because
up properly, so
I
I
heard
really
you talk about
appreciate
it
that.
last week, so.
Okay. There we go. That's that technology using power. This image is taken from St. Louis in October, during the first October protest, so about 2.5 months after Michael Brown's killing. And it's one of my favorite images that I took. It's just an actual iPhone photo that I took. But you had curfews that were imposed in St. Louis. And a group of young people, called, at that time they were called Lost Voices, very, very young, most of them teenagers, early 20s, who decided that they were just going to camp out. And they camped out first using their book bags, and they wanted to resist these forms of policing where if you didn't remain constantly in motion, people were being arrested for civil disturbances and for various offenses. So their idea was actually to occupy a space, and they chose this semi-abandoned lot. There's actually a little like small business mall that's next to it, but they created an encampment, and they set up initially just book bags, and they started sleeping out on the street. And people saw them, and out of solidarity started bringing food and bringing tents, and they sort of started to grow and grow. And they created this mural, which I thought was so powerful, out of masking tape, which they simply put on the fence. Justice. So Lost Voices to me is important because it's an example of how you had a new generation of activists that were created who had never been really politically involved. But the politicization that happened with the killing of Michael Brown, things that I was talking about, that sense of vulnerability, of identification with what happened to Michael Brown, that this too could happen to us, really led to the creation of a whole new group of activists in a matter of weeks. And so you have Lost Voices, and the idea of Lost Voices is that many different voices have been lost throughout the generations. So it's linking what happened to Michael Brown to multi-generations within St. Louis. My own family comes from St. Louis, which is something I didn't say. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, but my entire extended family lives there. And St. Louis is a deeply racially divided, that's a nice way of putting it, but it is a deeply segregated and very violent place. I considered writing a PhD dissertation on St. Louis, and I actually decided not to, because I looked at the East St. Louis race riots up through the 1960s, and in contrast to Oakland, which I wrote about in Living for the City, St. Louis never had a sustained Black Power movement. It's a city that, in interviewing Ferguson protesters, many of them who are in their early 20s say, well, one reason we're doing what we're doing is that our parents, were still living through Jim Crow in the 90s. And, a traditional historian would correct them and say, no, Jim Crow ended in 1965, it was legally dismantled. But to me, they were expressing the depth of segregation, segregation, occupational segregation, urban divestment that exists in St. Louis. So I was really struck that they used this term, Lost Voices, that they wanted to link what happened with Michael Brown to a longer history of really a struggle in St. Louis that has remained invisible. One of the amazing things about protests is that things that were once invisible become visible. Populations that were ignored are suddenly heard. Suddenly they are on the cover of a magazine, both in the case of Watts in 1965 and in the case of the early protester. And I think someone else, I'll just go in order.
I was wondering, what your buddy means for those that are involved in culture rights or rights from what we learned from the activism of the 60s, 70s, and now what we're doing today.
I'm going to take a second question that's up here also.
So
I'll start with the first question. Recommendation for Black Lives Matter. I think that first is the importance of political education. I think that that is, for me, the single most important thing. And I think that I actually gave a talk at the School of Oriental Studies last night in London. And there were a lot of American students there. It was really interesting. People were active in Black Lives Matter. It's a deeply, deeply politicized campus. And we were having a dialogue about this. And they were saying that, you know, we're so under the gun. There's so much, you know, we're suffering so much police repression. There's so little time. You know, we feel a real sense of urgency to act. And I respect that. I think it's very important. That sense of urgency is absolutely crucial to political organizing. On the other hand, one of the things that the Panthers did brilliantly was it wasn't just political education in order to raise people's consciousness. It was also the tactical use of political education. I'll give you a very good example. So the Black Panther Archive is in Stanford University. There's still a lot to be written about the Black Panther Party out there, for those of you who are interested. The history of New York and Los Angeles have not been written yet. There's still a lot to be done. A really good history of women and gender in the party is still to be done. So the archive is in Stanford University. And I was looking through the archive, and in 1973, the Panthers run an electoral campaign in Oakland. And it's a remarkable thing. They don't win, but they force a runoff with the Republican incumbent, where they get between 35 and 40% of the vote. This is an incredible thing, right? We're lucky if, you know, third parties get 5% of the vote, and they literally get between 35 and 40% of the vote. So the question is, how do they do this without funding? And the main way they did it was, one, college students, people in public campuses were their primary campaign workers. But as I was going through the Panther Archive, I found where they had taken the tables of the census districts in Oakland, and they had circled in red the census districts that had the highest population of people between 18 and 25. And that's where they sent their organizers, to those areas in the city. And that's what I mean about political education. I think that the places of vulnerability in the state are not always obvious. Standing in front of a prison will get you coverage, but that may not be the best way to actually have a prison shut down. And figuring out, using analysis and research to figure out what the points of vulnerability is very important. I think that one of the problems right now is that we have these very important protests, but figuring out how you move from protest to strategic intervention is an important one. And so it's not just education in the abstract sense, and this links me also to talking to your question, not simply knowledge for knowledge's sake, but knowledge for tactical purposes. And I think that, you know, when you have such disproportionate resources, you know, between, you know, this kind of edifice that I've talked about of a carceral state, or Shanti's term, the prison industrial complex, you have a huge imbalance of resources. But I think that one thing to be learned from the Black Panthers, and also more broadly from different kinds of left organizations, is that the intellectual production and the use of analysis and strategy has been very important to them. You know, it's hard to understand the Cuban Revolution without understanding how they were able to use analysis and why literacy was so important to their campaign. So that would be my biggest point, is that political education is really important. And I would also say that the Panthers suffered a level of repression that we have long-term political prisoners. You know, we have roughly between 30 and 40 people that are shot and killed that are members of the organization. They were truly organizing at a time of crisis. And what I described in 1969, where you have a full-on onslaught by SWAT onto the Panther headquarters in Los Angeles. But they're still engaging in political education. They saw that as absolutely essential to their struggle. And I don't think it's actually something that can wait. I think it was foundational to the movement. And one of the examples that Shanti mentioned I think is very interesting is Jacobin. Jacobin is an online magazine that was started by a 23-year-old Trinidadian in Brooklyn, who's now 26, that also publishes it in print. And they provide syllabi and study groups. Syllabi and materials for study groups across the country. You can write to them. If you want to start a Jacobin study group, they will send you for free syllabi, copies of Jacobin, pamphlets. And I think that what they're doing to me is the counterpart to what the Panthers did with the Black Panther newspaper. So this creating of self-sustaining institutions. I could talk about this for a very long time. But the second thing I would say is that being dependent on foundation money is a problem. really a huge problem, particularly the Kellogg Foundation, and other foundations that have shaped the course of the movement. The not-for-profitization of protest in the United States and what other people talk about in the international context, the NGOization, I think there are not-for-profits and NGOs that do good things. I'm not going to dismiss them categorically, but I think that it is a very different type of politics than we saw of grassroots subscriber organizations that had their own independent base. And that would be the second big point, is that seeking foundation money and being reliant on mainstream press coverage is not a good way to build a movement. It's very, very vulnerable, it's short-lived, and it undercuts the possibilities, I think, for real social change. To move to your question, out of space, out of time, on the college campus. Williams, in some ways, is very isolated. I experienced it as very isolated. As I was taking a car up from New York City, I realized how far it is from a major city. Not that I've forgotten, I was reminded. That's a hard question, because I think that when I was at Williams, I was also isolated in some ways. But this, to me, was a time of the depth of learning that was important. And I think that education is extremely precious. It's more precious for some than for others. You know, we're seeing a real polarization in access to education. So I think that part of it, I mean, I myself am so deeply invested in this. I was a first-generation college attendee on my mother's side. So just being on a college campus is not something I take for granted. And so I think valorizing education is really important. The social isolation that can entail on a campus like this is very, very hard. And I'm sympathetic to that. I know that what we did is we did a lot of road trips. You know, we went down to CUNY, to Center for Puerto Rican Studies, and it was a whole very vibrant community, including Shanti's father, that was at Brooklyn College, and we had contact with other, also CUNY, we had contact with other campuses. I also went to a lot of protests when I was here, you know. But for me, one of the foundational social movements really was AIDS activism. It was the formation of ACT UP, Silence Equals Death. And in the 1980s, that was such a vibrant struggle, and it's hard to even describe what it was like seeing people you know die, and people you admired. Like, I remember when Alvin Ailey died, because I was a dancer in high school, and my greatest ambition at that time was to be a member of Alvin Ailey. And so having contact with activist organizations, actions, and grassroots protests. That's what I did often when I wasn't on campus. But I do think that it's a challenge. I'm curious to hear what you guys are doing. I'd love to know how you're dealing with it in this moment. Because I really... Oh, you go to 5 colleges? Yeah, we also do that too. You hang out in Amherst? It happens. And Smith. Other comments or questions?
Thank you for your comment. Question, maybe to shed light, I think on a theme that we kind of touched on for the last, and that's the shadow of capitalism in the story, the shadow of capitalism and the growth and progression of the pastoral state, especially as that face and form of capitalism is transforming. You made references to deindustrialization. The capitalism is there, it's a constant presence, but it's also a transforming presence. So I wonder if you can speak to is what we're seeing here an outcome of that transformation of the capitalist system, deindustrialization of the U.S., movement of jobs from within the U.S. to somewhere else, and how that shapes and informs the state's own response to this population.
So the question is, what role does capitalism play in thinking about a carceral state? This is a big debate going on right now between historians and sociologists and different schools of thought. Do we think of the carceral state as Michelle Alexander argued the new Jim Crow, that this is a reconfiguration of what we saw in following Reconstruction? I think that there's a complex interaction between politics and economics and understanding why we had these overlapping, what I call domestic wars. At their core, in their origin, I think that they were critical. That's my own interpretation. That this movement, both of the migration from of white Southerners and white ethnics from the Democratic Party in 1964 and the Republican Party in 68 that reaches its ultimate expression in Ronald Reagan's election in 1980, that this is a core response to the enfranchisement of African Americans. So it's so important, as I'm sure all of you know here, but the weight and the depth of this I never fully understood until I was writing about the Black Power movement, that African Americans don't really have full citizenship rights until 1965. It's that recent. It's 50 years. It's really important. We have a short period after Reconstruction, really only about 7 years, where you have federal military that are sent to the South to protect the right to vote of Black men. But in terms of both genders being able to vote, you have selective voting in the North, but you still have gerrymandering of voter districts and a population overwhelmingly concentrated in the South. So the kind of seismic shift that's created in American politics when African Americans are fully politically incorporated into the country is foundational to this. So in my own interpretation, I think that both in terms of electoral politics and understanding the campaigns, I didn't talk about it in detail, but you have two different wars on drugs. You have the declaration of Nixon's war on drugs in 1971. You have the passage of the Omnibus Crime Control Act, which sets up the LEAA in 1968. And this rhetoric of law and order is first used against the civil rights movement in the South. It's talked about as criminality. That after 1965, this becomes very important for mobilizing white backlash. So that political piece is extremely important. Now, where do the economics fit into this? There are scholars like Loic Bacquant who would argue that the carceral state is simply an expression of neoliberalism, that we're entering a period in the 1970s where, for the first time, we're seeing a falling rate of wages for the white population. So it's really important that the United States, the American dream, is not false for the white population. The United States has steadily increasing property ownership and wages until the 1970s for the white population. African Americans and Indians and other populations are a separate question. But it's in the 1970s that we begin to see wage stagnation and then this beginning of downward mobility, which has vastly accelerated since the Reagan administration. So you have the oil shocks and stagflation of the 1970s, and you have this perception of a global economic crisis. And it's out of that crisis, especially in England with the Labour Party and in the United States, that we begin to see a turning away from programs of social welfare and redistribution and the beginnings of mass incarceration. The economic piece of it I do think is important. However, I'm especially struck that neoliberalism is a global phenomenon. You see it also in England, you see it in France, but you don't see a system of mass incarceration. And I'm very hesitant to use the language of American exceptionalism. Once upon a time, American exceptionalism was the language of the left. So we used it to talk about why is there no socialism in the United States. This is true even 20 years ago. But now it's become something entirely different. But the US system of punishment is unprecedented. I mean, the closest is Brazil. And I think that this is where, when we were talking about links to Palestine and international comparisons, a lot of literature now is focused on settler colonialism and looking at the US as a function of settler colonialism. Because many of these carceral surveillance and policing functions of the state are especially strong in former and current settler colonial societies. So going back to the economic piece, you begin to see, for example, in not only the cutting back of the Great Society in the 1970s, but the institution of things like a 1-800 number where you can report your neighbor if they're receiving AFDC, if you see they're buying a coffee table and you don't think they should, you can report them for welfare fraud. So you begin to see not only this cutting back of social welfare, but the criminalization and carcerality within social welfare itself. So I do think there is a deep link to economics. I also think this is why I talked extensively about the 1980s and the end of the Cold War. With the end of the Cold War, you have the emergence of this kind of unipolar power of the United States, both militarily and economically. And I think that the not having an antagonist, not having a state socialist antagonist, in many ways opened the path for kind of an unprecedented power and access of capital. So there's more to be done than that, and I'm still thinking about what that economics is. In terms of straightforward incentives for the carceral state, questions of civil forfeiture, which is that if you're accused of a drug crime, your property can be seized. There are direct incentives for police departments. So one is a kind of expropriation and taxation, almost a form of taxation, also like we saw in Ferguson, where the state is making profit off of criminalization of people. That's one piece. But another one is the internal economy inside the state itself. So once you have the federal government getting involved in subsidizing local police departments, you have local police departments that are benefiting from this federal subsidy. So that in itself has an economic logic to it. So in terms of deindustrialization and capital movement, I think deindustrialization is important, but I will say, having come from a Rust Belt city that was 95% white, you never saw the kind of criminalization that you did in black urban areas. So there's a very complex interaction between race and class, and I think when I talked about America's most vulnerable, I think particularly the most vulnerable are populations of color that are also low income.
So I think it's back to the artist first day, and trying to work capitalism and socialism have come up a lot. And I'm wondering what you think about this. I think about it in one sense, that helps us understand the historical context of where we are today, and I think we deal with a kind of separation from what's happening right now, and kind of limits our discussion to these reform schools of thought. And so I'm wondering whether you think that discussing these issues within the framework of socialism and capitalism are useful, or whether we need like this totally new vocabulary for our issues today.
I don't think anything is ever totally new. That's the first thing. That's partially because I'm a historian. Very modern in the past. I don't think there's enough discussion of capitalism and socialism, actually. I don't think this is dominant in the United States. In fact, this is the first time in my lifetime that I've seen it discussed, the things that have become almost a cliche with the 1%. That was a really profound formulation from the Occupy movement. This popular expression and anger about the upward redistribution of wealth is actually not that common in U.S. history. It's very uncommon. What's much more common, I'd say, is actually people mobilizing politically against their own economic interests. So I actually don't think there's enough talk about capitalism and socialism. I really don't. I think that we're seeing in the university a resurgence of people writing about the history of capitalism, and it was in the 1960s and 1970s in a period of real politicization. You saw this, a lot of debates around capitalism and slavery, about what the role of capitalism was in forms of expropriation. But I think that in some ways economics has become a science that's very divorced from ordinary people and is highly technocratic. So even understanding the instruments of what capitalism is for people that don't actually operate in the financial sector, that's why I talked about arbitrage for Williams. This was a place where there was an intense discussion of political economy, but it wasn't political economy as Karl Marx talked about it. It was about people being prepared to go work in the highest levels of the banking sector. So I think that there needs to be a lot more popular education about capitalism, and it's something that's very hard to understand if you're not part of those circles. And socialism is even lesser known. There's a lot of interest right now in socialism, but I think it's probably different in a campus like Williams than it is at Rutgers, but young people are still kind of searching for what socialism is. If you ask people who like socialism, there have been these surveys that say it's higher than 50%. But if you ask them, do you think that Social Security should be privatized and you should have a choice in investing in your own Social Security? They also say yes. And what that says to me is there's actually not enough deep knowledge about socialism. Now that said, being always analyzing the conditions of the moment, I think, are very important. And in contrast to that period that I was talking about in the 1980s, where there's still, critical though we were, of various state socialist projects, there was still a notion of state, of the role of the state, in ways that I see, particularly in Black Lives Matter and other movements. Many people have stopped making claims on the state because we feel so politically marginalized. So I think that, anarchism has had a real resurgence. and many of the young prison activists are anarchists. So I think that, political tendencies shift and change. So adapting it to the needs of the moment, I think, is absolutely important. I would never advocate recreating my generation's vision, but even knowing what it was, I think, would be helpful, just as I studied the generation before me. Oh, great, a whole bunch of comments.
I'm a 76-year-old retired sort of high school teacher. And I remember many years ago, during summer school, which was a plum to get for 6 weeks and make some extra money, I decided to teach a course on revolution rather than on making up your math course in 9th grade or Regents prep course or something like that. Got a great enrollment. And then it petered out because after all there was, they gave revolution and nobody came to play. The school started. I think that there is an extraordinarily vulnerable and possibly hopeful moment between 16 and 22 for the people who are sitting in this room, who are students now. How many of you are freshmen? Just raise your hands. How many of you are freshmen? Freshmen? Nobody? A few. I can't turn my neck. Okay, a few. How many sophomores?
Question. To Donna.
I'm asking a question about why isn't the mobilization focusing on the time that you guys are in school, in coursework? Why shouldn't part of the coursework be action work for credit? Not a gold star, real 3-4 credit courses. Purchase College runs a senior requirement. They have to do, every graduate of Purchase College has to do a senior project. There's a thin paper.
Is that your question, sir?
Yet my question is, why, could you speak a little bit about the lost possibilities and opportunities for people to be in action program, not taking opportunities to teach for America?
Oh, that's a big question. I'm going to take a couple other comments because we have a bunch of people put their hands up.
Hi, thank you very much. I guess you spoke to the promise of the Panthers in kind of really extending their reach in coalition building, and I believe you're also speaking tomorrow as to the ties between Ferguson and Palestine. Could you possibly speak a little to, I guess, the importance of coalition building and any other social justice movements that you see as especially relevant at this point in time to Black Lives Matter? And yes, thank you.
I'll take just one more question. Do you have your hand up too? Right next to it? Yes, please.
I was wondering if you could point us towards some the most exciting restorative justice and transformative justice work that you've been seeing happening, and also work that is being led by folks that have been formerly incarcerated.
Okay, I'll take those 3 questions and then some more. Young people have mobilized. That's the first thing I would say. The last 14 months has witnessed a real mobilization of young people. One of the exciting things about Ferguson is that this is actually not elite mobilization. Many of the people involved are people who have felony convictions, who were formerly incarcerated, and came from, not from Washington University. They came from Harris Stowe, which is historically black college there. And the way I describe them, the things I published about it, is there were a lot of people involved in that protest that were people with bad jobs. People that hate their jobs. People that have 2 jobs that are paid very little and don't have health insurance. So, yes, I think that right now, in my lifetime, this is the most politicized I've ever seen young people be. Now, the question is, what can institutions of higher education do in order to support that. There are schools, Purchase has it, Rutgers has service learning component. That's a conversation to be had among faculty and students about how do we institutionalize support for this. But I agree with you, I think that's very important. Teach for America, unfortunately, I feel has done a great deal of damage. It's been absolutely essential for the charterization movement. In terms of, can I just add something about that? DeRay McKesson saying that the Panther School valorizes charter movement. This is not true. This is not true at all. It's really a sin against history. On the importance of coalition, thank you for asking that question. That I also could talk about at length, but we'll try not to talk about it too long. The Panthers had a very different vision of coalition than Black Lives Matter. That's really important. I think that there's the invocation of the Panthers, Asada taught me, but this relates to what I was saying about political education. Sustained study of the newspaper, sustained study of the history. Because the Panthers really believed in a moment of worldwide decolonization in which they saw struggles as interlinked. And their core focus was not on difference, but on shared opposition. Now I say that, these are people that saw themselves as the heirs of Malcolm X. The first platform of the Black Panther Party in their 10-point program is, we believe in the right of Black self-determination. So this starts out as a Black nationalist organization. So it goes without saying, it was an all-Black organization. It was Black-led, it was Black-run, it was Black-staffed. That goes without saying, and it was involved in an incredible iconography of Black pride. I mean, this is the Panther image from 1968. So, but their vision about how they understood their relationship to other groups, they actively saw themselves as linked to the Young Lords Party. They were integrally linked to the Brown Berets. So Black and Brown struggle is core to them. They have their base, after all, in California, which is a multi-ethnic state. So I think that I am sometimes troubled by the lack of engagement, particularly with brown populations in California. So much of the anti-police organizing in California is flowing out of Black and brown communities. The people that have successfully fought gang injunctions, all these forms of criminalization that I was talking about, many of these are Chicano organizations and Latino organizations. And I don't feel that these two populations can be separated. I really don't. I don't think the history of anti-Black racism is separate from the history of imperialism. And I think for the Panthers, anti-colonial struggle and anti-imperialism is at the core of what they are. So anti-Blackness is, I would not describe the Panther ideology as its core focus as anti-Blackness. Its core focus was anti-imperialism and the vision of a unified, multiracial, but led by Black people. That is the historical movement, right? Black people, they saw themselves as leading. And we would be naive to think that the Panthers they were not an incredibly forceful organization. And I deal with that in Living for the City. You know, much of what made them famous and made them powerful also had other effects, for example, on the internal politics of the party. But I think we have to be very careful about segmenting other people and not putting front and center anti-colonial struggle as well as anti-capitalist struggle. And I would like to see more talk about that. I really would. I would also say that, the Panthers have not been fully included in some of this anti-state sanctioned violence movements that we see today. I can say that for certainty because I was in Los Angeles and observing it. There's an indication of the symbolism of the Panthers. But I do think it's important not only that we valorize youth organizing, but that we see multi-generational coalitions. I think that's really, really important. And that relates to the question of coalition, not only coalitions against race and ethnicity, but multi-generational coalitions, looking to an older generation of Black radicals, and whether that's the Black Panther Party or even going further back to Eric Williams, C.L.R. James, and Walter Rodney. This is an essential tradition. And organizing and understanding that there is such a thing called the Black left, that is a real thing and that matters, and the Panthers were Black leftists. So I feel strongly about that, both in terms of coalitions with our own community, because we have divisions within our own community as people of African descent, but also building bridges with other groups. I'm very interested in hearing about restorative justice. I'm still in the process of researching it. One of the organizations that I'm most interested in right now is Shut Down Rikers, which is an attempt to, which I'm actually active in, to shut down Rikers and to try to figure out how to target local struggles. I, partially because of personality and sensibility and being a social historian, I really love trying to find specific struggles in which you can fight big battles. And in New York City right now, Rikers is a core focus. In Los Angeles, much of that energy is focused on fighting gang injunctions and gang enhancements, and the primary method of criminalization was used in Los Angeles to criminalize black and brown youth, was the designation of people as gang members. So just to give you an example of this, by 1992, 47% of the black male population between the ages of 18 and 24 are designated as gang members. And what does that mean legally? That means that you can be stripped of your constitutional rights. You can be arrested for waving at someone else who's included in a gang database. You can be arrested for showing up in a neighborhood that has been designated as a gang neighborhood. That may be where you live. Maybe you're 14 years old and you have been put in a gang database and been served with a gang injunction. Then it becomes illegal for you to return to your own neighborhood. So the scale of this kind of criminalization. So I think a lot of the organizing efforts in Los Angeles fighting gang injunctions and gang enhancements, and this gets us into a whole question of what the carceral state is. One piece of it is people who are given low-level misdemeanors, they enter the system, and when you see that a whole case law is brought to bear against them that citizens who have a different legal status don't suffer from. So I think, especially if you're in targeted local efforts, and this goes back actually to your question, looking locally, and I don't just believe in working locally, I think you need to look obviously globally and nationally, but there's so much to be done in each local area. I think this is a battle that has to be waged with looking at, thinking about the university linkages with grassroots groups, and looking within your immediate organizing area. One thing that was started in Rutgers, it actually came out of an initiative in the history department, was to start doing prison teaching and outreach and to provide, basically to provide young people that have had felony convictions with a protected status and full scholarships to study at Rutgers. So creating this direct reverse, like prison to school pipeline, which is a really great thing. And I think that those points of nexus and intersection with the formerly incarcerated, with the people who are most affected, just as in the era of civil rights and black power, it's the people who are most affected that have the greatest knowledge need to be central. So I think forging partnerships, especially with the formerly incarcerated, is very important.
Oh, wait, somebody else did the last question.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking today. So I thought it was really interesting that you mentioned internationalism and the influence of internationalism on the Black Panther Party. And you also talked about Maoism and Marxism on the ideological sort of formulation of the began sort of the activism broadly in the 1960s and 70s. And I have a question about sort of the involvement of yellow also. You talk about black and brown, but I think there was also a hidden history of the Asian American radical movement, and that's something that I'm very interested in. There's the Yellow Brotherhood, there's the Blue Pointer or Red Guard, and I guess my question really has to do with the situation today. With Black Lives Matter and this resurgence of discussion, how do you see sort of Asian Americans incorporated in this movement? I'm sorry for making this question so specific, but this is something that I'm very interested in, and I don't see a lot of Asian American representation in this movement, and really in general. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this interracial sort of development, interracial relationships contemporarily.
Thank you for that. I'll take just one more question and I'll answer them simultaneously.
Hi, so I'm a little hesitant, I want to derail conversations, but you were talking about surveillance and surveillance by the state. I was wondering if you work with an encounter post 9/11 in surveillance and sort of infiltration of Muslim American communities, and also thinking about the history of Black American Muslim communities as well, and that
Thank you for that. So I'll start with answering the first question. It's so important that the Panthers are founded in Northern California. They really are. That relationship to Asian American activists, but also to the Vietnam War is absolutely crucial. That image that I showed You know, I don't know if you can see this, but the billy club that they're carrying says napalm. So, the context is really the Pacific, you know, it is in Northern California that they're looking at the Pacific. The Pacific is the primary point of disembarkation for soldiers being sent to the Vietnam War. One of the theories about why the San Francisco Bay Area becomes a central place for queer organizing is that from World War II forward, it is the central place of disembarkation for the war in the Pacific. So that gives you a sense of how foundational it is in terms of, you know, this period from the 1940s to the 1970s. I guess the 1940s to the 1990s, America's half century, you know, military dominance. The Western theater of war is so important. And so one of the interesting things about the Cold War is that these forms of warfare also engender their own contradictions. So what you see on the West Coast is a deep identification with black radicals, with Ho Chi Minh especially, and to some extent with Mao. I'd say the strongest identification is with Ho Chi Minh. But the Panthers are Maoists. They're at least nominally Maoists. You know, they sell the Red Book. They quote sayings from Mao. Power flows through the barrel of the gun is a quote from Mao, of course. So there's a kind of culture of radicalism of both looking to China and to Vietnam, but also the ties between Iwar Kun and the Red Guard Party. There's actually a Latino Red Guard Party in Los Angeles that invited me to give a talk. That was interesting. Maoism is still alive and well in certain sections of East Los Angeles. So the first non-black member of the Black Panther Party was Japanese American, Richard Aoki. And he's become a figure of controversy because of FBI revelations. Well, they are revelations, whether we believe them or not is another question. But there are deep ties also with Japanese Americans in Northern California. So that anti-colonial tradition in the 1960s and 1970s is very strong. I think that, you know, there's a fracturing, to be honest, that has happened in California, particularly with migration patterns, you know, with heavy migration from Taiwan. And, you know, there's a strong, very conservative anti-communist presence also of Asian Americans in California. So in the 1990s, one of the battles that's fought in California were affirmative action. You have heavy representations of Asian Americans opposing affirmative action for African Americans and other groups. So I think that some of this reflects the differences between the 1960s and 1970s and the natures of settlement patterns. But hearkening back to this period of unity and struggle is a very important one. And I think Asian American studies and Asian American scholars have done a very important work of historical recovery, of reminding us of this period of alliance and the centrality of struggles in Asia for Black people's own sense of Black consciousness. So you see that obviously in the consumption of kung fu movies and of, you know, kind of Black Asian, both politics and aesthetics. I'm especially struck by that in New York City. I mean, there's such for that generation of Zulu Nation, Golden Era hip hop. You know, Bruce Lee is such a foundational figure for them. So there's not only the political alliances of organizations like the Panthers, but also a deep sense of things that are shared culturally. The maintenance and the building of these relationships, I think, can be difficult. And I think, for me as a historian, my starting point is always to go back and to recognize where we have had solidarity in the past in order to build it in the present.